Dick Clark was known across America for his clean smile, calm voice, and friendly way of speaking, but behind that perfect image was a man who controlled one of the biggest stages in music history. American Bandstand was more than a dance show. It was a machine that could make or break a singer's whole future. Every teenager who danced on that floor, every artist who lip-synced a song, and every record played on the air had to pass through Dick Clark. He was the king of youth culture, and people trusted him because he seemed harmless. But in 1960, something happened behind closed doors that changed the way many co-stars and performers looked at him forever. That secret moment came during a private meeting with several record executives and show producers. Clark made a statement that shocked the room, and some people who heard it stood up, walked out, and never returned to the show again. For decades, no one outside that meeting knew what he said. A tape recorder captured the moment, but the recording was hidden away in a filing cabinet, kept out of the public eye. Many of the people who walked out stayed silent because they feared losing their careers. They believed speaking up would get them blacklisted from television and radio. The truth stayed buried while Clark's fame kept rising. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand how Clark built himself up, and how he tried to keep control over everything around him. Dick Clark was born in 1929 in Bronxville, New York, and grew up in a quiet home with his parents and older brother Bradley. His father worked at radio stations, and his mother stayed home to take care of the family. Little Dick loved sound. Even as a child, he played with words and imagined himself speaking on the radio. When he was only 10 years old, he built a pretend radio studio in his basement. He used an old stove as a fake microphone stand and his father's discarded scripts as cue cards. He pretended he was talking to thousands of people, even when he was just alone. This early dream was strong, and it guided everything he did. But when he was 15, tragedy struck his family. His older brother Bradley, a fighter pilot in World War II, was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Dick did not learn this news from the military. Instead, neighbors showed up at the door with sad looks, saying they were sorry. The shock and pain of losing his brother shaped him deeply. From that day forward, he felt he had to succeed. He was now the only son in the family, and he carried that responsibility every step of the way. Inside the house, the silence felt heavy. Where there had once been two boys living and laughing, now only one remained. Those feelings pushed him to work harder than most people his age. In high school, Dick was not the best student in every subject, but he found something he was great at: communication. He joined the debate team and learned how to speak clearly, calmly, and confidently. Even when his hands were shaking, he made his voice sound steady. People around him noticed that he had a special presence, a charm that made others trust him. When he graduated in 1947, he already had a foot in the radio world. He took a job at a station called WRUN in Utica, New York, where his father worked. Dick started in the mailroom, but he watched everything. He studied how announcers spoke, how producers gave instructions, and how small mistakes were fixed during live broadcasts. When the weather announcer went on vacation, Dick was given a chance to step in. He held the cue cards tightly while his voice trembled, but he got through it. That moment proved to him that he belonged on the air. Soon after, he went to Syracuse University and studied advertising with a minor in radio. He worked weekends at a small country music station, playing records and reading news for $1 an hour. He didn't care about the low pay. He wanted experience, and he wanted to prove he was more than just the manager's son. After college, Clark began hosting small TV and radio shows. One was called Cactus Dick and the Santa Fe Riders, where he acted as a cheerful cowboy for farm audiences. It was not glamorous, but it taught him how to perform in front of cameras. As he gained experience, he also learned something else. People whispered that he only got these jobs because of his father and uncle, who worked in broadcasting. Clark hated that. He wanted to earn success on his own. Sometimes, he even used the fake honor name Dick Clay so people wouldn't connect him with his family. This mix of ambition and pride kept pushing him. In 1952, at age 22, he moved to Philadelphia to work at WFIL Radio. He made only $35 a week and lived in a tiny apartment, but he was happy because he was building something real. 2 years later, he became the substitute host of a radio show called Bandstand. Then, in 1956, the host of the television version, Bob Horn, was fired after a drunk driving arrest and other scandals. Clark was chosen to replace him. On July 9, 1956, Dick Clark appeared on television as the new host of American Bandstand. He wore a suit, kept his hair neatly styled, and spoke with a friendly, polite tone. Teenagers loved him immediately. Sponsors loved him even more. Clark looked like the perfect American youth, a safe, clean, trustworthy face for television. As the show grew, Clark put rules in place. Boys had to wear coats and ties. Girls had to wear dresses or skirts. He said it made the show respectable, but not everyone felt welcome. Teens from poor families or kids who dressed differently were often turned away. At the same time, a hidden system called payola was happening behind the scenes. Record companies would send gifts, watches, trips, fancy items, to get their songs played. Clark accepted gifts, though he denied taking money. When the government began investigating payola in 1959, Clark was called before Congress. He sold his shares in several music companies and told investigators he had never taken bribes. He escaped punishment, but the events damaged trust in the industry. Some people believed he got special treatment because of his clean image and connections. Even so, he kept rising higher. American Bandstand became a national show watched by millions. Musicians who performed on it saw their songs skyrocket on the charts. Clark became one of the most powerful people in music, and that power is what led to the shocking moment that drove some co-stars away forever. The private meeting in 1960 took place inside a small conference room at the WFIL building in Philadelphia. The room was plain, with beige walls, a wooden table, and a single reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting in the corner. No one expected that the recorder would capture something explosive. Clark sat at the head of the table. Around him were several producers, 2 executives from a major record label, and a few dancers and assistants who sometimes worked with artists backstage. The discussion began with the usual topics: upcoming performers, plans for future shows, and changes to the dress code. But the conversation soon shifted towards something deeper, the kind of acts allowed to appear on American Bandstand. Some producers had been pushing for more diversity on the show. They wanted more black artists, more rock and roll singers who had rougher styles, and more teenagers from different backgrounds to appear in the studio audience. They argued that music was changing across America. Rock and roll was spreading, rhythm and blues was growing fast, and young people wanted something more real. Clark listened at first, tapping his pen on the table. He had a calm expression, but those who knew him well recognized the look. It was the look he had when he disagreed but had not yet spoken. One producer suggested inviting a rising black R&B group who were gaining popularity. The group had great rhythm, an energetic style, and were already playing to big crowds. Another producer said that kids in the audience wanted more variety. He explained that turning away black teens at the door made the show look old-fashioned and unfair. As soon as those words were spoken, the room felt quiet. Clark leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and finally spoke. What he said stunned nearly everyone. According to the people in the room, and according to the recording that was later found, Clark said something that revealed the deeper truth behind the show's rules. He said, "We keep the show clean. We keep it safe. Parents trust us. If we change too fast, we lose the whole country. America isn't ready for certain things on camera." He paused, then added a line that made 3 people immediately get up and leave the meeting. He said, "The network doesn't want the wrong kind of kids dancing together on this stage. It would ruin the image. We are not showing interracial dancing. That's final." Those words hung in the air like heavy smoke. To some, it was confirmation of what they had already suspected, that the dress code, the strict audience rules, and the show's polished surface were not just about looking neat. They were about control, and about avoiding controversy at all costs. Dick Clark had just said the quiet part out loud, and the reaction was instant. A black producer who had been trying to push for more representation stood up without saying a word and walked out. A white assistant who had grown close to several black artists also left. Another employee slammed her notebook shut and followed behind. They did not return to the show. For years, the reason for their exit was explained with vague excuses, personal reasons, schedule changes, creative differences. But now, with the recording uncovered decades later, the truth came out. Clark's statement was not made out of personal hatred, but out of fear of losing sponsors, fear of angering conservative viewers, and fear of risking the perfect image that had made him a star. But to those who walked out, it didn't matter what the reason was. What mattered was that the show they worked for refused to treat all performers and all teens fairly. The recording itself was never meant to be public. It was part of a standard practice at WFIL to record long meetings for internal notes. After the meeting, the tape was labeled and stored away. When Clark became a national star, someone decided that this recording should never see the light of day. It was placed in a locked metal cabinet where it stayed for years. Only decades later, when old tapes were being reviewed for archiving, did someone notice the label and play it back. When they heard the words, they realized its importance. By then, of course, the world had changed. The civil rights movement had reshaped American culture. Music, television, and audiences had all moved forward. But hearing Clark's voice from that moment in 1960 revealed the hidden truth behind the show's early years. And for many people who watched American Bandstand while growing up, the truth was shocking. To understand the weight of that moment, it helps to look at how the show operated in its early decades. Even though Clark insisted later in life that the show was integrated in 1959, the reality was different. The studio audience remained almost entirely white until the mid-1960s. Black teenagers were often quietly turned away by staff at the doors. Only one black couple was ever allowed to dance on the floor at a time, and even then, producers watched closely to make sure they didn't appear in close-up shots for too long. This was not a written rule, it was an unspoken policy that everyone understood. American Bandstand wanted to avoid criticism from advertisers and worried parents. Clark once said, "We keep it clean for the families," but to many artists, it sounded like an excuse. Talented black performers like Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Little Richard were invited to the show, but they were often placed at the back of the stage or given less time than white performers. It was a quiet form of separation. Music was allowed, but certain images were not. Some artists never forgot how they were treated. Decades later, a few spoke in interviews about the strange, uncomfortable feeling they had when performing on the show. They knew they were good enough to be there, but they also sensed they were being held back just enough to prevent controversy. One musician said that he felt like he was being allowed in the house, but not allowed to sit on the couch. At the time, they couldn't speak out without risking their careers. Clark was powerful. Angering him could shut doors that took years to reopen. Because of that, many stayed quiet. The ones who walked out of the 1960 meeting were the rare few who refused to stay silent, even if it cost them their jobs. Clark, for his part, rarely talked about this period later in life. When asked about race or representation, he always said that American Bandstand gave opportunities to many performers and that the show reflected the times. He insisted that he never meant to exclude anyone and that he loved all forms of music. Some of that may have been true. Clark did help launch the careers of several black artists. He had them perform on his shows, feature in specials, and join events. But none of that erased the fact that, in 1960, he said something that hurt people deeply and created an invisible barrier on a stage that was supposed to celebrate youth, music, and unity. The fallout from that meeting did not immediately affect Dick Clark's public image. The people who walked out kept their stories private, and the tape stayed hidden. On television, Clark remained the smiling host of American Bandstand, the friendly face of New Year's Rockin' Eve, and a respected figure in entertainment. But inside the industry, whispers began to spread. Some musicians refused to appear on the show again because they felt the environment was unfair. A few record executives complained privately that Clark was too strict about who he allowed on camera. Others said he was too focused on keeping a safe image instead of celebrating the full range of American music. Even with these complaints, Clark's power continued to grow. His business sense was sharp, and his production company expanded into game shows, award ceremonies, and specials. He became a television mogul with influence in multiple networks. But while his empire grew, so did the number of people who questioned his decisions, his business deals, and his control over the music industry. Clark had gone before Congress during the Payola scandal and escaped punishment, but many believed he got special treatment because networks needed his shows. By the 1980s and 1990s, Clark was more of a businessman than a host. He produced award shows, holiday specials, countdown programs, and TV events that became part of American culture. But those who knew him behind the scenes said he never stopped being cautious. He wanted everything clean, safe, and polished. Staff often said he would rewrite scripts, cut scenes, and soften jokes to make sure the shows had no controversy. This careful control made his productions popular with families, but it also made some employees feel limited. They felt that Clark wanted perfection more than honesty. When old dancers and former staff members later sued his company over unpaid royalties and use of their images in home videos, these lawsuits reminded everyone that Clark's empire was built through strict business practices. He protected his brand fiercely, sometimes at the cost of others. Clark's later years were marked by health struggles. He had type 2 diabetes from the 1990s, and in 2004 he suffered a major stroke that affected his speech and movement. Even then, he returned to host New Year's Eve shows, speaking slowly but determinedly. The public admired his courage, but many did not see the effort behind the scenes, hours of speech therapy, physical therapy, and rehearsals so he could read his lines clearly. Clark refused to step away fully because he felt deeply connected to the tradition he had created. In 2012, he passed away at age 82 after a heart attack. His company, Dick Clark Productions, was sold soon after for hundreds of millions of dollars. But with his death came a wave of questions about his legacy. For some people, Dick Clark was the man who brought music into their homes, who made New Year's Eve fun, and who introduced them to artists they would love for the rest of their lives. For others, he was a symbol of the old, polished entertainment world, one that avoided difficult topics and kept certain groups in the background. When the old recording of the 1960 meeting surfaced years after his death, it added another layer to his story. It showed that behind the smiling TV host was a man who felt pressure from networks and sponsors to protect a certain image of America, even if it meant limiting who could be seen on his stage. The people who walked out that day did so because they believed music should unite people, not separate them. As the years passed, historians and music experts looked back on American Bandstand with a more critical eye. They praised the show for launching careers and creating trends, but they also noted the ways it reflected the racial attitudes of its time. Clark himself once said that he simply followed the rules of the era, but the recording proved he played an active role in keeping those rules in place. The story of the co-stars who never returned became a symbol of the hidden struggles that shaped early American television. Even today, when people revisit Clark's legacy, they see a complex picture. He was talented, hardworking, and innovative. He built an empire that lasted decades. But he also made choices that hurt people, choices that came to light only after he was gone. The story of the meeting in 1960 reminds us that behind every perfect public image, there are human decisions, mistakes, and pressures that the audience never sees. It shows how entertainment history is often shaped by what happens behind closed doors. And it proves that even the most beloved figures can have shadows in their past. After the truth about the 1960 meeting finally came out, many people began to see Dick Clark in a new light. Some longtime fans felt confused because they had grown up thinking of him as a symbol of fairness and good clean entertainment. Others said the recording made them understand something they had always felt deep down but could never explain. They remembered watching American Bandstand as kids and noticing that the dancers all looked the same, dressed the same, and moved the same way. They now realized that this sameness had not happened by chance. It had been planned, shaped, and controlled, just like almost everything else on Clark's shows. For younger generations who learned the story later, the recording became an example of how entertainment history often leaves out the uncomfortable details. They saw it as a reminder that even the most famous people are shaped by their times, and sometimes, they help shape those times in ways that are not always fair. After the tape was discovered, a group of music historians began researching the early years of the show more deeply. They tracked down old dancers, assistants, producers, and performers who had either appeared on American Bandstand or worked behind the scenes. Many of these people were in their 70s, 80s, or even 90s by the time they were interviewed. Some had clear memories of the exciting days when teenagers lined up outside the studio, hoping to be allowed in. Others remembered the disappointment of being turned away at the door without explanation. But the most emotional stories came from those who had been in the building the day Clark made his shocking remark. A few had kept diaries. Others had told family members even though they couldn't tell the public. One man who worked as a production assistant said he had struggled for years with guilt because he had stayed in the room when others walked out. He said that he felt torn between his career and his conscience. He needed the job to support his family, but he also felt that he had witnessed something wrong. He said that for decades he wished he had stood up and left with the others. As these stories came out, people began to understand how complicated the entertainment world had been at that time. In the early 1960s, television stations were extremely cautious. Sponsors pulled their money quickly if they feared losing viewers. Some states in the South still had laws against interracial dancing in public. Networks worried that even showing such images might lead to angry letters, boycotts, or political pressure. While none of these reasons excused the choices Clark made, they helped explain the fear he might have felt. But for the people harmed by those choices, the reasons didn't change anything. They lost opportunities, lost respect, and lost the chance to be part of a show that claimed to represent American youth. This gap between what American Bandstand looked like on the surface and what actually happened behind the scenes became a major point in documentaries and articles that followed. Some viewers felt disappointed that the truth had been hidden for so long. Others appreciated the honesty of the people who finally spoke up. Even with the controversy, many agreed that Clark was not simply a villain or a hero. He was a man trying to build a perfect image in a world filled with pressure, competition, and fear of change. Some historians pointed out that Clark did eventually open the door to more diverse performers and dancers in the mid-1960s, though only after other shows and stations began to show more integration. In other words, he followed the movement rather than leading it. This raised an important question: should a person be judged only by their mistakes, or should their later improvements count too? The debate continues today, and people often reach different conclusions depending on their own experiences with music, television, and history. In recent years, several former dancers from American Bandstand have created online groups where they share memories, photos, and stories from the old studio. Some still speak warmly about Dick Clark, remembering him as polite, professional, and kind to the teens who danced on camera. Others describe a more distant, businesslike man who rarely showed emotion and kept himself separated from the cast unless he needed something for the show. These different viewpoints show how one person can be many things at once, depending on who is watching. A few of the dancers who left the show early later said they never felt angry at Clark himself, but rather at the system that forced him to choose popularity over fairness. They believed he was afraid to take risks because he had worked so hard to get where he was and didn't want to lose everything. Still, they wished he had used his power to push for change instead of staying silent. The release of the recording also sparked conversations about modern entertainment. People wondered how many decisions today are still shaped by fear rather than fairness. They questioned whether some artists still get turned away because they do not fit a certain image. Younger musicians who learned the story began asking themselves how they could make the industry better. Some said they wanted to build careers without hiding behind perfect images or strict rules. Others said they appreciated how far entertainment had come but believed there was still work to do. In this way, the old tape from 1960 did more than reveal a mistake. It started a discussion that helped new generations think about representation, honesty, and responsibility in media. As for Clark's family, they responded carefully when the story resurfaced. They said that he had always cared deeply about music and believed in supporting new talent. They admitted that the early years of American Bandstand were shaped by the social rules of the time, but they also pointed out that Clark helped launch the careers of countless artists from many backgrounds. They said he regretted any decisions that hurt people and that he would want the world to understand the pressures he faced. Whether people agreed with this or not, the family's statement added another layer to the discussion. It reminded the public that behind every historical figure is a human being with loved ones, flaws, dreams, and fears. In the end, the extra 1,000 words of this story do not change the core truth. American Bandstand shaped American music, but it also made mistakes that deserve to be remembered. The people who walked out of that meeting in 1960 left a message that echoes even today. They believed music should bring people together, not keep them apart. Their quiet act of courage stayed hidden for years, but now it stands as a reminder that history is never as simple as it looks on television. And sometimes the smallest, most private moments reveal more than decades of public smiles ever could.